The morning sun had just begun to shine over the busy city. Cars filled the roads as people hurried to work. Some people were going to offices, some were opening their shops, while others were already working hard before breakfast. On the other side of the city stood a large construction site. It was one of the biggest building projects anyone had ever seen. Huge machines moved slowly across the land. Trucks carried loads of sand, gravel, cement, and bricks. Workers in bright safety vests walked from one place to another, each person busy with an important job. The sound of hammers hitting wood mixed with the loud noise of machines digging into the ground. Dust floated gently through the air as workers carefully built what would soon become a beautiful apartment complex. The construction company belonged to Daniel Brooks. Daniel was one of the richest businessmen in the country. He owned hotels, shopping malls, office buildings, schools, and construction companies. Many people knew his name because almost every month he started another big project somewhere in the country. Even though Daniel was a billionaire, he was not proud or rude. He believed that every worker deserved respect. He often told his managers that no building could stand without the people who worked with their hands. That morning, Daniel decided to visit the construction site himself. A long black SUV slowly drove through the large entrance gate. Security guards quickly opened the gate and greeted the driver. The vehicle stopped near the site office. The workers immediately noticed the expensive car. "It must be Mr. Brooks," one worker whispered. "The boss is here today," another said. Many workers straightened their helmets and continued working even harder. The driver's door opened first. A security officer stepped out and looked around before opening the back door. Daniel Brooks stepped out of the SUV. He was tall and handsome. He wore clean black trousers, brown safety boots, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a bright yellow safety helmet. His smile made him look friendly instead of frightening. The site manager hurried over. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." Daniel smiled warmly. "Good morning, James. How is everything going?" "We're making good progress. The workers have been doing an excellent job." "I'm glad to hear that." James began showing Daniel around the construction site. As they walked, Daniel greeted every worker they passed. "Good morning. Keep up the good work. Be careful with those blocks." The workers smiled because it was rare to see such a wealthy man greet everyone politely. Daniel stopped several times to ask questions. "Is everyone receiving enough safety equipment?" "Yes, sir." "Are the workers getting enough drinking water?" "Yes, sir." "Has anyone been injured recently?" "No, sir." Daniel nodded with satisfaction. He believed caring for workers was just as important as building houses. As they continued walking, Daniel suddenly noticed something unusual. Near one corner of the site, a woman was carrying 2 heavy cement blocks across her shoulders. Most workers carried only 1 block at a time because they were heavy, but this woman carried 2 without slowing down. Daniel stopped walking. He watched quietly. The woman placed the blocks exactly where they were needed before walking back for another load. She moved with confidence. Her arms were muscular. Her shoulders were broad. Her hands were rough from years of hard work. Sweat covered her face, but she never complained. She simply kept working. Daniel looked surprised. "I've never seen someone that strong," he quietly said. James smiled. "That's Grace." "Grace?" "Yes." Daniel continued watching. Grace picked up another heavy load that 2 men had been struggling to move together. Without asking for help, she lifted it and carried it across the site. The nearby workers laughed happily. "There goes Grace again," one man said. "She's stronger than all of us," another joked. Grace laughed with them. She was not trying to show off. She simply enjoyed working hard. Daniel became curious. He watched her for several more minutes. Unlike some workers who stopped often to rest or complain about the heat, Grace never wasted time. She worked carefully and patiently. Whenever another worker needed help lifting something heavy, Grace was the first to walk over. "Let me help you," she would say with a smile. She never expected anything in return. Daniel admired that. "Tell me more about her," he asked James. The site manager sighed. "Grace has one of the saddest stories I've ever heard." Daniel looked at him. What happened? She lost both her parents many years ago. Daniel listened quietly. She had to leave school because there was nobody to pay the fees. That's unfortunate. James nodded. Since then, she's been doing different jobs just to survive. Farming, cleaning, carrying loads, construction work, anything honest that helps her earn money. Daniel looked back at Grace. Does she have a family? No. Is she married? No. Where does she live? James hesitated before answering. She doesn't really have a home. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? She sleeps inside an old abandoned storage shelter near the back of the construction site. It's the only place she has. Daniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. She sleeps here? James nodded sadly. Every night. Daniel remained silent. He looked toward the old building James had pointed at. It was small. Its roof was damaged. Some of the windows were broken. It was hardly a place anyone should call home. Yet that was where Grace lived. Daniel looked back at her again. She was smiling while helping another worker lift bags of cement. There was no anger on her face. No sadness. No bitterness. Only determination. Daniel found that surprising. Many people who had much easier lives complained every day. But Grace, who had almost nothing, still smiled. As they continued their walk around the site, Daniel found himself looking toward Grace again and again. He could not explain why. There was something different about her. It was not only her strength. It was her attitude. She worked with honesty. She respected everyone. She never acted like a victim. She simply focused on doing her best. A few minutes later, the workers took a short water break. Grace walked over to a small cooler and poured herself a cup of water. She sat under a tree for a few minutes to rest. Daniel looked at James. I'd like to meet her. James smiled. Of course. The two men walked toward Grace. When Grace noticed them coming, she immediately stood up. She wiped the sweat from her forehead with a small towel and smiled politely. Good morning, sir. Daniel smiled back. Good morning. Grace respectfully shook his hand. My name is Grace. I know. She looked surprised. You do. Daniel laughed softly. I've been watching you work. Grace looked embarrassed. I hope I wasn't doing anything wrong. Not at all. You work harder than almost everyone here. Grace smiled shyly. I just try my best. Daniel noticed that her voice was calm and respectful. She did not seem nervous because he was rich. She simply treated him like another human being. I heard you helped several workers this morning. Grace nodded. If someone needs help and I can help, then I should. Daniel liked that answer. They talked for only a few minutes because Grace did not want to waste working time. Finally she smiled. I should get back to work, sir. Daniel nodded. Of course. Grace returned to her duties without asking for favors or trying to impress him. Daniel watched as she lifted another stack of bricks and carried them toward the building. For some reason, he could not stop smiling. As Daniel and James walked away, James quietly asked, What do you think of her? Daniel looked back one last time. I think she's one of the hardest working people I've ever met. James smiled. I agree. Daniel climbed back into his SUV after finishing his inspection. As the vehicle slowly drove away from the construction site, he looked out of the window. In the distance, he could still see Grace carrying bricks with steady steps, smiling as she worked under the bright morning sun. For the first time in many years, Daniel found himself thinking about someone long after leaving work. He did not fully understand why. All he knew was that the strong, kind, homeless bricklayer had made an impression on his heart. Without realizing it, Daniel was already looking forward to visiting the construction site again. Daniel Brooks could not stop thinking about Grace after leaving the construction site. As his black SUV drove through the busy streets, he looked out of the window, but his mind was somewhere else. Normally, after visiting one of his projects, he would spend the rest of the day thinking about business. He would review building plans, attend meetings, sign important papers, and speak with company managers. But this time was different. Every few minutes, Grace's face came back into his mind. He remembered the way she smiled while carrying heavy bricks. He remembered how she helped other workers without expecting anything in return. He remembered how she spoke politely and honestly. "There is something special about that woman," he quietly said to himself. His driver looked into the rearview mirror. "Did you say something, sir?" Daniel smiled. "No, I was just thinking." The driver nodded and continued driving. When Daniel arrived at his company headquarters, everyone greeted him with respect. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Welcome back, sir. Your meeting starts in 10 minutes. Daniel smiled politely at everyone before entering his large office on the top floor. The office was beautiful. It had shiny wooden floors, expensive furniture, large windows, and a wonderful view of the city. Yet, for some reason, it did not feel as interesting as the construction site he had just left. His personal assistant, Olivia, entered the office carrying several files. "Good morning, Daniel." "Good morning, Olivia. I've prepared today's schedule." She placed the files on his desk. "You have a meeting with investors in 10 minutes, lunch with the mayor at 1 o'clock, and another meeting with the architects this afternoon." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." Olivia noticed he seemed distracted. "Is everything all right?" Daniel smiled. "Yes, I was just thinking about the workers at the new construction site." Olivia smiled. "They're doing well? They're working very hard." She nodded. "That's good to hear." She left the office, but Daniel was still thinking about Grace. The entire day passed slowly. Even during important meetings, Daniel found himself remembering the strong woman who never complained despite having such a difficult life. By evening, he had already made up his mind. "I'll visit the site again tomorrow." The next morning, Daniel arrived at the construction site much earlier than before. The workers were surprised. "The boss came back already? He was just here yesterday. I wonder why." Daniel greeted everyone with his usual warm smile. "Good morning." "Morning, sir." Instead of asking the site manager to give him a tour, Daniel looked around until he spotted Grace. She was mixing cement with 2 other workers. Her clothes were covered with dust, but she worked with energy. Daniel walked toward her. Grace looked up and smiled. "Good morning, sir." "Good morning, Grace." She wiped her hands before shaking his hand. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." Daniel laughed. "I wanted to check on the project." Grace smiled. "I'm sure everyone is doing their best." Daniel noticed she was breathing heavily after working. "Have you had breakfast?" Grace hesitated before answering. "Not really." "You haven't eaten?" "I drank some water before coming to work." Daniel frowned. "Only water?" Grace smiled as if it were normal. "I'll eat after work." Daniel felt sad. Working such a hard job without eating breakfast could not be easy. Without saying another word, he turned toward his driver. "Please buy breakfast for everyone working here." The driver nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." About 30 minutes later, several boxes of hot food arrived. Rice, eggs, bread, tea, fruit, and bottled water were shared among all the workers. Everyone smiled with excitement. "This is wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. We appreciate it." Daniel smiled. "You all work hard. You deserve a good meal." Grace accepted her food with grateful eyes. "Thank you." Daniel noticed she waited until everyone else had received their meals before opening hers. Again, she thought about others before herself. After breakfast, work continued. Daniel stayed at the site longer than usual. He watched the workers from a distance. Grace continued lifting bricks, carrying cement, and helping anyone who needed assistance. At one point, an older worker struggled to move a heavy wheelbarrow filled with sand. Before anyone asked, Grace hurried over. "Let me help." Together they pushed the heavy load to its destination. The older man smiled. "Thank you, Grace." She laughed. "We're a team." Daniel smiled quietly. Kindness like hers was difficult to find. Later that afternoon, Daniel found Grace taking a short break under the same tree where they had spoken the day before. He walked over carrying 2 bottles of cold water. "Mind if I sit here?" Grace smiled. "Of course not." Daniel handed her 1 bottle. "Thank you." For a few moments, They simply drank their water while enjoying the gentle breeze. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Grace nodded. "Yes." "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 2 years." "You've been doing construction work that long?" She smiled. "Actually, I've been doing hard work since I was a teenager." Daniel looked at her with curiosity. "What happened?" Grace looked toward the unfinished building before answering. "When I was 12 years old, my father became very sick." "I'm sorry." "He couldn't work anymore." Grace's smile faded slightly. "My mother tried to take care of all of us, but life became difficult." "What happened after that?" "My father passed away." Daniel lowered his head. "I'm very sorry." A year later, my mother also became sick. Grace took a deep breath. "We didn't have enough money to pay for medicine." Daniel remained silent. "My mother died too." Daniel felt his heart become heavy. "So you were left alone?" Grace nodded. "There were no close relatives willing to care for me." "What about school?" "I had to leave." "You never finished?" Grace shook her head. "I wanted to continue learning, but survival came first." Daniel listened carefully. "I worked anywhere people would hire me." "What kinds of jobs?" "I cleaned houses. I worked on farms. I carried goods in markets. I washed cars. I even helped fishermen." Daniel admired her courage. "You've worked very hard." Grace smiled. "Life isn't always easy." "No, but giving up never helps." Daniel noticed something surprising. Even while talking about painful memories, Grace never sounded angry. She simply accepted life and kept moving forward. "Where do you sleep?" Daniel gently asked. Grace pointed toward the old storage building behind the construction site. "There." Daniel looked at it again. The building looked even worse up close. The roof had several holes. The walls were cracked. The floor was bare concrete. "I've cleaned one corner. I spread an old blanket there. It keeps me dry when it doesn't rain." Daniel found it difficult to imagine someone living there. "Aren't you afraid?" Grace smiled. "Sometimes. But I pray every night." Daniel admired her faith. "What do you dream about?" Grace looked surprised. "My dream?" "Yes." She thought quietly before answering. "I don't dream about becoming rich." Daniel smiled. "No, I only want a small home, a clean place to sleep, a kitchen, a little garden, and enough food every day." Daniel looked at her. "That's all." Grace nodded. "I don't need a mansion. I just want peace." Daniel realized he had spent millions of dollars building luxury homes, yet this woman would be happy with a small house and a garden. Her simple dreams touched his heart. The afternoon passed quickly. The workers returned to their jobs. Daniel remained at the site much longer than anyone expected. Before leaving, he walked over to Grace one last time. "It was nice talking with you." Grace smiled warmly. "I enjoyed talking with you too." Daniel hesitated for a moment. "I'll probably visit again." Grace laughed softly. "You're always welcome." Daniel smiled. "I'll hold you to that." As he walked back toward his SUV, he turned around once more. Grace had already picked up another stack of bricks. She was laughing with the other workers while continuing her job. Daniel shook his head with a smile. She had every reason to be unhappy. She had no parents, no home, no education, very little money, yet she carried herself with hope instead of bitterness. As his vehicle drove away, Daniel realized something important. He had visited the construction site 2 days in a row, but he had spent more time talking with Grace than inspecting the building. He smiled to himself. For the first time in years, work was no longer the only thing filling his thoughts. Without even realizing it, a beautiful friendship had begun to grow between the billionaire and the strong, homeless bricklayer. The days passed quickly, and Daniel Brooks continued visiting the construction site. At first, everyone thought he was simply checking on the progress of the building. After all, he was the owner of the company, and it was normal for him to inspect his projects. But after nearly 2 weeks, people began to notice something different. Daniel stayed longer than before. He no longer rushed through the site with the manager. Instead, he spent time talking to the workers. He asked if they had enough drinking water, whether they had eaten, and if anyone needed help. Most of all, he always found a reason to speak with Grace. Sometimes they talked during the workers' lunch break. Sometimes they spoke for only a few minutes before Grace returned to carrying bricks. Other times, Daniel simply watched her work from a distance, smiling as she laughed with the other workers. The workers began whispering among themselves. "I think the boss likes Grace. I noticed that too. He comes here almost every day now. He never used to do that." One older worker laughed. "I've worked here for 10 years. I've never seen Mr. Brooks visit one site this many times." The others smiled. Grace heard some of the whispers, but she ignored them. She had never imagined that someone as rich as Daniel could be interested in her. To her, he was simply a kind man who respected everyone. She never treated him differently because of his money. Daniel liked that very much. Most people acted nervous around him. Some only wanted favors. Others wanted money. But Grace never asked him for anything. She was happy to earn her living with her own hands. That was one of the many things Daniel admired about her. Meanwhile, back at Daniel's company headquarters, someone else had started paying close attention to his behavior. Her name was Olivia. She had worked as Daniel's personal assistant for 5 years. She knew his daily schedule better than anyone. She arranged his meetings, answered his calls, prepared his documents, and reminded him about important appointments. Daniel trusted her completely. She had always been hardworking and professional. But there was one secret she had never shared with anyone. She had fallen in love with Daniel. It had not happened overnight. Year after year, she had admired his kindness, intelligence, and generosity. Whenever he smiled at her, her heart raced. Whenever he praised her work, she felt happy for the rest of the day. She secretly believed that one day Daniel would notice her as more than an employee. She imagined them having dinner together. She imagined him asking her to marry him. Sometimes, while sitting alone in her apartment, she even dreamed about becoming Mrs. Brooks. Those dreams made her smile. She never told Daniel how she felt. She wanted to wait for the right moment. She believed that if she stayed loyal and worked hard, Daniel would eventually see how much she cared about him. But everything changed after Daniel started visiting the construction site. At first, Olivia thought nothing of it. "He owns construction companies," she told herself. "Of course he'll visit his sites." But then she noticed something strange. Daniel asked to rearrange his meetings more often. "Can we move the afternoon meeting to tomorrow?" he asked one morning. "Certainly," Olivia replied. "I need to visit the construction site again." Again, Olivia frowned after he left. He had already visited the same site several times that week. The next day it happened again. "I'll be leaving after lunch." "Going to another meeting?" Olivia asked. "No, the construction site." Olivia forced a smile. "Of course." But inside, she was beginning to wonder why. One afternoon, Daniel returned to the office with a cheerful expression. He looked happier than usual. Olivia noticed it immediately. "You seem to be in a good mood today," she said. Daniel smiled. "It was a good day." "I'm glad to hear that." He placed a folder on his desk before speaking again. "The workers are doing an excellent job." "That's wonderful." Daniel nodded. "Especially one of them." Olivia became curious. "Oh, there is a woman named Grace." Olivia listened carefully. "She's one of the hardest working people I've ever met." He smiled as he spoke. "She never complains. She helps everyone. She has such a positive attitude." Olivia felt her stomach tighten. Daniel rarely spoke about people this way. He continued talking. "She's been through so much, yet she still smiles every day." Olivia nodded politely. "She sounds impressive." "She really is." Daniel looked out of the office window. "I've learned a lot from her." Olivia forced herself to smile. "I'm happy for you." But the moment Daniel left the office for another meeting, her smile disappeared. "Grace," she whispered. "So that's her name." That evening, Olivia could not stop thinking about the woman Daniel had mentioned. She opened her laptop, She searched through company records until she found the list of workers assigned to the construction site. There it was. Grace, bricklayer, temporary worker, no permanent address, no emergency contact. Olivia stared at the information. A homeless bricklayer? She could hardly believe it. This is the woman Daniel keeps talking about? She leaned back in her chair. Why would someone like Daniel be interested in someone like her? The question stayed in her mind all evening. The next morning, Olivia decided to find out for herself. She drove to the construction site without telling Daniel. As she stepped out of her car, the workers looked at her with curiosity. She was dressed in a neat business suit and high heels. She looked completely different from everyone working there. The site manager greeted her politely. "Good morning. I'm looking for Grace. I'll call her." A few moments later, Grace walked over. She was wearing dusty work clothes and carrying a shovel. She smiled politely. "Good morning." Olivia looked Grace up and down. She noticed Grace's strong arms and broad shoulders. Her hands were rough from years of hard work. Sweat covered her face. Yet there was something warm about her smile. For a brief moment, Olivia understood why people liked her. But that feeling quickly disappeared. "So you're Grace?" "Yes. I've heard about you." Grace smiled. "I hope only good things." Olivia forced a small laugh. "I'm Daniel's personal assistant." Grace nodded politely. "It's nice to meet you." Olivia expected Grace to become nervous after hearing Daniel's name. Instead, Grace remained calm. She treated Olivia with the same respect she showed everyone else. Olivia did not like that. "You and Daniel seem to spend a lot of time talking." Grace smiled. "He's a kind man. That's all. He asks about the workers. We talk sometimes. Nothing more." Olivia looked directly into Grace's eyes. "You know he's a billionaire." Grace nodded. "Of course. And you're just a bricklayer." Grace answered calmly. "That's true." Olivia expected Grace to feel embarrassed. Instead, Grace simply smiled. "I work honestly. I'm proud of my job." Those words annoyed Olivia even more. As Olivia drove back to the office, her thoughts became darker. She's pretending to be innocent. No woman spends that much time talking to a billionaire unless she wants something. She gripped the steering wheel tightly. I won't let her take Daniel away. She remembered all the years she had spent by Daniel's side. She had worked late nights. She had canceled holidays. She had helped him through difficult business problems. She believed she deserved his love, not some homeless construction worker. From that day forward, Olivia began watching Daniel more closely. Every time he smiled after returning from the construction site, her jealousy grew. Every time he mentioned Grace's name, she became more upset. She stopped seeing Grace as a stranger. She started seeing her as a rival. Daniel, however, knew nothing about Olivia's secret feelings. He believed she was simply doing her job as always. He had no idea that the woman he trusted the most was slowly allowing jealousy to fill her heart. And Olivia herself did not realize that jealousy was changing her. What had begun as silent love was becoming dangerous. She made a quiet promise to herself. "No matter what happens," she whispered, "I will never let Grace take Daniel away from me." Those words marked the beginning of a conflict that would soon change all of their lives forever. The bright morning sun shone over the construction site as another busy day began. Workers arrived one after another, wearing their safety helmets and work boots. Some carried bags of cement. Others pushed wheelbarrows filled with sand and gravel. The loud sound of machines filled the air as the day's work started. Grace was one of the first people to arrive. Like always, she swept the area where she would be working before picking up her tools. She believed that a clean workplace was a safe workplace. "Good morning, Grace," one of the workers called. She smiled. "Good morning, Peter." Another worker waved. "Morning. Morning." Grace replied cheerfully. Everyone liked Grace because she was kind to everyone. She never argued with people. She never spoke badly about anyone. If someone needed help carrying heavy materials, she was always willing to lend a hand. That morning, She was lifting stacks of bricks onto a wooden platform when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Grace." She turned around. It was Daniel. He was wearing his white shirt, dark trousers, safety boots, and yellow helmet. As always, he smiled warmly. "Good morning," he said. Grace smiled back. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." Daniel laughed softly. "I've told you many times. You can call me Daniel." Grace smiled shyly. "It still feels strange." "Why?" "Because you're my boss." Daniel chuckled. "And you're my friend." Grace looked down for a moment before smiling again. "All right, Daniel." Hearing his name from her made him smile even wider. "I'm glad." The two walked slowly through the construction site while the workers continued with their jobs. Daniel asked, "Did you sleep well?" Grace nodded. "I did." "Did the rain bother you last night?" Grace looked toward the old storage building where she slept. "A little." The roof leaked again. Daniel frowned. "I wish you didn't have to live there." Grace smiled gently. "It's only for now." Daniel looked at her. "You always say that." "Because I believe things can change." Daniel admired her positive attitude. "So do I," he replied. As they continued walking, they stopped beside a stack of cement bags. Daniel asked, "Have you ever thought about doing another kind of work?" Grace smiled. "I've thought about it." "What would you like to do?" She laughed softly. "I honestly don't know. I've spent most of my life doing jobs that require strength." Daniel nodded. "You're certainly good at them." Grace laughed again. "My muscles agree." The two laughed together. Several workers noticed them talking. One worker whispered, "Look at them." Another smiled. "They look happy together." An older worker nodded. "I think the boss truly likes her." Grace did not hear the whispers. She was too busy enjoying the conversation. Daniel found himself forgetting about work whenever he spoke with her. For the first time in years, he looked forward to visiting a construction site. Not because of the building, but because of Grace. Meanwhile, across town, Olivia sat inside Daniel's office. She stared at today's schedule lying on the desk. Once again, Daniel had canceled an afternoon meeting. Reason: visit construction site. Olivia sighed. Again. She closed the file and leaned back in her chair. She remembered seeing Grace the previous day. The image of the muscular bricklayer would not leave her mind. "Why her?" Olivia whispered. "I'm educated. I've worked beside Daniel for years. I've always been there for him." She looked out the office window. "I should be the woman standing beside him." Her jealousy grew stronger. Finally, she stood up. "I'm ending this today." About an hour later, Olivia's car pulled into the construction site. Unlike Daniel, she did not smile at the workers. She walked quickly through the site, carefully avoiding the muddy ground. The workers looked at one another. "Who is that?" "Mr. Brooks' assistant." "What is she doing here?" Grace was mixing cement when one of the workers walked over. "Grace." "Yes. Someone is looking for you." Grace wiped her hands with a cloth before walking toward the visitor. When she saw Olivia, she smiled politely. "Good morning." Olivia gave a small nod. "We need to talk." Grace noticed the serious expression on Olivia's face. "Of course." The two women walked away from the workers until they reached a quiet corner of the site near a pile of wooden boards. Grace spoke first. "Is everything all right?" Olivia crossed her arms. "I'll get straight to the point." Grace listened quietly. "You need to stay away from Daniel." Grace blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry." "You heard me." Grace looked confused. "I don't understand." Olivia's voice became colder. "Stop spending time with him." Grace remained calm. "Daniel comes here because he owns this company. You know that's not the reason." Grace frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Olivia took a step closer. "He comes here because of you." Grace shook her head. "I don't think that's true." Olivia laughed sarcastically. "Don't pretend you don't notice." Grace answered honestly. "I've never thought about it that way." Olivia folded her arms tighter. "Then think about it now." Grace remained silent. "You and Daniel come from completely different worlds." Grace nodded. That's true. He's a billionaire. Yes. You're homeless. Grace lowered her eyes for a moment before quietly answering. Yes. You sleep inside an old building. Yes. You carry bricks for a living. Yes. Olivia stared at her. So why are you getting close to him? Grace looked up. I'm not trying to. What? We became friends naturally. Olivia shook her head. I don't believe you. Grace sighed softly. I've never asked Daniel for money. I've never asked him for gifts. I've never asked him for a better job. Olivia remained silent. I simply answer when he talks to me. Olivia narrowed her eyes. You expect me to believe that? Grace nodded. Because it's the truth. For a few seconds, neither woman spoke. The sounds of hammers and machines echoed in the distance. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. I've loved Daniel for years. Grace looked surprised. You have? Yes. I've stood beside him through everything. I know what he likes. I know how he drinks his coffee. I know his schedule. I've always been there. Her voice became emotional. And then you appeared. Grace could hear the pain in Olivia's words. She spoke gently. I'm sorry you feel hurt. Olivia frowned. I don't need your sympathy. Grace remained calm. I wasn't trying to insult you. Olivia looked directly into Grace's eyes. If you care about Daniel, you'll stay away from him. Grace thought quietly before answering. I can't make that decision. Why not? Because Daniel chooses who he wants to talk to. Olivia clenched her fists. You could refuse. Grace shook her head. Why would I refuse to be friends with someone who has only been kind to me? Olivia had no answer. Grace continued. I've never tried to take him away from anyone. I don't even know what the future holds. But I won't be rude to someone simply because another person tells me to. Her voice stayed soft. She never raised it. She never insulted Olivia. She simply spoke honestly. That calmness only made Olivia angrier. So that's your answer? Grace nodded. My answer is that everyone deserves kindness. If Daniel wants to speak with me, I won't ignore him. But I'll never use him for his money. Olivia scoffed. That's easy to say. Grace smiled gently. I've lived without money for many years. I know how to survive. I don't need someone's wealth to be happy. Those words surprised Olivia. For the first time, she wondered if Grace was actually telling the truth. But jealousy refused to let her believe it. Instead, she pointed a finger at Grace. You'll regret this. Grace looked at her calmly. I hope we can still treat each other with respect. Olivia laughed bitterly. Respect. She turned around. You've already taken the one thing I wanted. Without another word, Olivia walked back toward her car. Grace watched her leave. She felt sad. Not because she was afraid, but because she could see how much pain jealousy had caused. She quietly whispered to herself, I hope she finds peace. Then she picked up her gloves and returned to work. When Daniel arrived later that afternoon, he immediately noticed Grace seemed quieter than usual. He walked over with a smile. Hi, Grace. She smiled back, though not as brightly as before. Hello, Daniel. He studied her face. Is everything okay? Grace hesitated. She did not want to create problems. She simply smiled. I'm fine. Daniel was not completely convinced, but he respected her choice not to say more. As they spoke, neither of them noticed Olivia watching from inside her parked car near the entrance of the construction site. She watched Daniel laugh with Grace. She watched Grace smile back. Her jealousy burned even stronger than before. She gripped the steering wheel tightly. So talking didn't work, she whispered. If she won't walk away on her own. Her eyes became cold. I'll have to find another way. She started her car and slowly drove away, already thinking of a much darker plan. One that would put all of their lives in danger. Several days passed after Olivia confronted Grace. Grace never told Daniel what had happened. She did not want to create problems between him and his personal assistant. Olivia had spoken to her with anger, but Grace believed that adding more conflict would only make things worse. Instead, She focused on her work. Every morning, she arrived before most of the workers. She swept her work area, checked her tools, and began carrying bricks, mixing cement, and helping wherever she was needed. She worked just as hard as she always had. Daniel, however, continued visiting the construction site almost every day. At first, the site manager thought Daniel was only making sure the project stayed on schedule. But after several weeks, it became clear that something else was bringing him there. One morning, Daniel arrived carrying several boxes. The workers looked at one another with curious smiles. "What did the boss bring today?" one worker asked. "I hope it's food again," another joked. Daniel laughed when he heard them. "It is food." The workers cheered. Soon everyone gathered around as breakfast was shared. There were sandwiches, fruit, juice, eggs, and hot tea. Daniel smiled as he watched everyone enjoy the meal. "You all work hard every day," he said. "You deserve a good breakfast." "Thank you, sir," the workers replied together. Grace accepted her food with a grateful smile. "Thank you, Daniel." "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "Seeing everyone happy is enough." The workers sat together under a large tree to eat. Some told funny stories. Others laughed about small mistakes they had made at work. Grace joined in the laughter. Daniel noticed something about her. She had very little, yet she always found reasons to smile. That was something he admired more every day. After breakfast, everyone returned to work. Grace was carrying a stack of heavy bricks toward the new building when one of the younger workers accidentally tripped over a pile of wood. The wheelbarrow he was pushing tipped over. Bricks rolled across the ground. The young man looked embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," he said. Before anyone else could help, Grace quickly walked over. "It's all right," she said with a smile. Together, they picked up every brick. Daniel watched from a short distance. He noticed that Grace never laughed at people when they made mistakes. Instead, she encouraged them. When the work was finished, the young worker smiled. "Thank you." Grace nodded. "Next time, just be careful." Daniel smiled to himself. Kindness came naturally to her. She never pretended to be good. She simply was. Later that afternoon, Daniel found Grace sitting under the shade of a tree during her short break. She was drinking water from an old bottle. He walked over carrying 2 cups of fresh lemonade. "I thought you might like something cold." Grace smiled brightly. "You keep surprising me." Daniel handed her one of the cups. "I hope you like lemonade." "I do." She took a sip. "It's delicious." The two sat quietly for a few moments. The warm breeze moved gently through the trees. Workers could be heard laughing in the distance. Finally, Daniel spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Grace nodded. "Of course. What makes you smile so much?" She looked surprised. "My smile?" "Yes. You've been through difficult things. You've lost your parents. You don't have a home. You work one of the hardest jobs I've ever seen." He looked at her kindly. "But you still smile almost every day." Grace looked down at her cup. She thought carefully before answering. "My mother taught me something when I was little." "What did she teach you?" Grace smiled softly. "She used to tell me that life becomes lighter when you carry hope instead of anger." Daniel listened quietly. "I didn't understand what she meant back then. But after she passed away, I remembered those words." She looked up at the sky. "I realized that if I spent every day being angry, nothing would change. So I decided to keep hoping." Daniel felt deeply moved. "That's a beautiful way to live." Grace shrugged gently. "It helps me keep going." Daniel smiled. "I think your mother would be proud of you." Grace's eyes filled with tears for just a second. "I hope so." The next few weeks passed peacefully. Daniel and Grace continued talking whenever he visited the construction site. Sometimes they talked about work. Sometimes they shared stories from childhood. Sometimes they laughed over funny things happening around them. One afternoon, heavy rain suddenly began to fall. The workers quickly stopped working and ran toward a large shelter to avoid getting soaked. Daniel was still walking across the site when the rain became heavier. Grace noticed him. "Daniel!" He looked up. "This way." She waved him toward the shelter. By the time he arrived, both of them were laughing. "We almost got caught," Daniel said. Grace smiled. "I think we did get caught." They looked at their wet clothes and laughed even harder. The workers smiled as they watched them. Peter whispered to another worker, "I've never seen the boss laugh this much." His friend nodded. "Neither have I." Inside the shelter, everyone waited for the rain to stop. Someone began telling jokes. Another worker shared funny stories from his village. Grace laughed until tears filled her eyes. Daniel found himself laughing too. For a while, everyone forgot about work. They simply enjoyed one another's company. When the rain finally stopped, Daniel looked at Grace. "I haven't laughed like this in years." Grace smiled. "I'm glad. So am I." As Daniel spent more time with Grace, he began noticing little things about her. She always shared her lunch if another worker forgot theirs. She picked up trash around the site even when it wasn't her responsibility. She encouraged workers who felt tired. She thanked people whenever they helped her. She even greeted the security guards every morning by name. Daniel admired every one of those little acts of kindness. One evening, after the workers finished for the day, Daniel noticed Grace sitting alone outside the old storage building where she slept. She was looking at the sunset. He walked over quietly. "Mind if I join you?" Grace smiled. "Not at all." They sat side by side on an old wooden bench. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The orange sky stretched across the horizon. Birds flew home. The construction site had become quiet. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I like spending time with you." Grace looked at him. "I like spending time with you too." Daniel smiled. "I always leave here feeling happier." Grace laughed softly. "Maybe that's because you finally take breaks from work." "You could be right." She looked at him. "You work too much." Daniel chuckled. "Everyone tells me that." "Maybe you should listen." "I think I will." Grace smiled. "I'm serious." "I know." The conversation felt easy. Neither of them had to pretend to be someone else. Daniel did not think about business when he was with Grace. Grace did not think about how rich Daniel was. They simply enjoyed being together. Over the next few days, the workers began noticing the growing friendship. One afternoon, Peter smiled as Grace walked past. "So?" Grace looked confused. "So what?" Peter laughed. "You and the boss." Grace immediately shook her head. "We're just friends." Peter grinned. "Friends who smile every time they see each other?" Grace laughed. "You're imagining things." Another worker joined in. "I don't think we're imagining anything." Everyone laughed. Grace covered her face, feeling embarrassed. "You people should get back to work." The workers laughed even harder. Daniel happened to walk by just then. "What are you all laughing about?" Peter quickly answered. "Nothing, sir." Daniel looked at Grace. She was still smiling. He smiled too. Whatever the joke had been, seeing Grace happy made him happy as well. That evening, Daniel returned to his mansion. The house was large, quiet, and beautiful. It had everything money could buy. Yet as he walked through the empty rooms, he realized something. The happiest part of his day had not been sitting in his luxurious office. It had not been signing business deals. It had not been driving expensive cars. The happiest part of his day had been sitting under a tree, laughing with Grace. He smiled as he thought about her. At the same time, Grace lay on her old blanket inside the abandoned storage building. The roof still leaked whenever it rained. The room was small and cold, but she found herself smiling before going to sleep. She thought about Daniel's kindness. She remembered how he always treated every worker with respect. She remembered how easy it was to talk with him. For the first time in a very long time, she felt that someone truly cared about her. Neither Daniel nor Grace spoke the words aloud. Neither admitted what was slowly growing inside their hearts. But every conversation, every smile, and every shared moment brought them closer together. Without even realizing it, their friendship was slowly becoming something much deeper. It was becoming love. Several weeks had passed since Daniel and Grace had become close friends. Their friendship continued to grow every day. Whenever Daniel visited the construction site, he always looked for Grace first. Sometimes they spoke for only a few minutes because she was busy working. Other times they sat together during the workers' lunch break and talked about life. Grace never treated Daniel like a billionaire. She treated him like an ordinary person. Daniel loved that. When he was with Grace, he forgot about business meetings, expensive buildings, and company problems. Around her, he could simply be himself. The workers noticed the change in him. One afternoon, as Grace helped carry bags of cement into the building, two workers quietly spoke to each other. "I've never seen Mr. Brooks smile this much." "Me neither. He looks happier every time he comes here. I think Grace has changed him." The older worker standing nearby smiled. Sometimes one good person can change another person's life. The others nodded in agreement. None of them knew that someone else was watching from a distance. Olivia. She had driven to the construction site again without telling Daniel. She remained inside her car, parked near the entrance where she could clearly see Daniel and Grace talking together. She watched Daniel laugh. She watched Grace laugh back. She watched them walking side by side through the construction site. Her heart burned with jealousy. "I warned her," Olivia whispered to herself. "I told her to stay away from him." She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. But she ignored me. The more she watched them, the angrier she became. She had worked beside Daniel for 5 years. She knew his favorite coffee. She knew which meetings he enjoyed and which ones made him tired. She knew his birthday, his favorite foods, and the names of his closest business partners. She had always believed that one day all those years of loyalty would lead Daniel to love her. Now she felt that Grace had taken everything away, without saying a word, without even trying. Olivia drove away with tears of anger in her eyes. Back at the company headquarters, Daniel returned to his office after leaving the construction site. He was still smiling. Olivia followed him inside with a stack of documents. "I need your signature on these contracts." Daniel nodded. "Leave them here." As he signed the papers, he quietly smiled to himself. Olivia noticed. "You seem very happy these days." Daniel looked up. "I suppose I am." "Anything special?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I've met someone who reminds me that life is about more than work." Olivia's heart skipped. "Someone?" Daniel smiled. "Grace." Hearing that name again made Olivia feel sick inside. "She's one of the strongest people I've ever met." Olivia forced a smile. "Strong. Not just physically." Daniel looked thoughtful. "She has faced so many hardships, but she never lets them change her kindness." He looked out the window. "I admire her." Olivia felt as though someone had squeezed her heart. She had never heard Daniel speak about any woman this way. Not once. After finishing the paperwork, she quietly left the office. The moment the door closed behind her, her smile disappeared. "So it's true," she whispered. "He's falling in love with her." That evening, Olivia sat alone in her apartment. The television was on, but she was not watching it. She kept thinking about Daniel. She remembered the first day she had started working for him. He had been kind, respectful, patient. He had never shouted at his employees. He had always treated her fairly. Those memories made her love him even more. But now every happy memory had become painful. She walked over to a mirror and looked at herself. "I've always done everything right." She turned slowly. "I have a good job. I dress well. I'm educated. I've always stood beside him." Tears filled her eyes. So why doesn't he love me? She thought about Grace, a homeless bricklayer, a woman who spent her days carrying bricks and mixing cement, someone who slept in an old storage building. Olivia could not understand it. What does she have that I don't? The question stayed in her mind all night. Instead of sleeping, she became more upset. Her jealousy slowly turned into anger. By morning, she had stopped asking why Daniel liked Grace. Instead, she started thinking about how to separate them. The next afternoon, Olivia visited a small cafe on the other side of the city. She sat alone at a table near the window. A few minutes later, a man wearing a dark cap walked inside. He looked around before sitting across from her. You called me, he said quietly. Olivia looked nervous. I need help. The man leaned back. What kind of help? She looked around to make sure nobody was listening. I want someone taken away. The man frowned. What do you mean? There is a woman. He remained silent. I want her kidnapped. The man stared at her for several seconds. Why? Olivia hesitated. I just want her out of my life. The man crossed his arms. Who is she? A construction worker. He laughed. You want to hire people to kidnap a bricklayer? Olivia reached into her handbag and placed an envelope on the table. The man quietly opened it. Inside was a large amount of cash. His eyes widened. There will be more, Olivia said. But only if the job is done. The man closed the envelope. When? As soon as possible. He nodded slowly. I'll gather some men. Olivia looked relieved. Good. There is one rule. What? Do not hurt her. I only want her taken away. The man nodded. We understand. After a few more minutes, both of them left the cafe through different doors. Olivia believed everything was now under control. She had no idea how strong Grace really was. Meanwhile, Grace knew nothing about the meeting. She continued living her simple life. Every morning she worked hard. Every evening she returned to the old storage building. She still dreamed of having a small home one day. She never imagined someone wanted to harm her. One evening, Daniel visited the construction site after most of the workers had gone home. Grace was cleaning her tools before leaving. Daniel smiled. Still working? Grace laughed. I like leaving everything neat for tomorrow. Daniel nodded. I've noticed. They walked together toward the entrance of the construction site. The evening sky was painted orange as the sun slowly disappeared. Birds flew across the sky. Everything felt peaceful. Daniel looked at Grace. Can I tell you something? Grace smiled. Of course. I've been happier these past few weeks than I've been in years. Grace looked at him. I'm glad. I think it's because of you. Grace stopped walking. Me? Daniel nodded. You remind me that happiness doesn't come from money. Grace smiled gently. I don't know about that. I do. Daniel looked into her eyes. I've spent years building businesses. I've made more money than I ever imagined. But talking with you has brought me more peace than many of those things. Grace felt her cheeks grow warm. She looked away shyly. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable. Finally, Grace smiled. I'm happy we're friends. Daniel smiled back. So am I. Neither of them said the words that were in their hearts. Neither admitted they were falling in love. But both of them felt it. Across the city, Olivia sat in her apartment waiting for a phone call. Late that night, her phone finally rang. She answered immediately. Hello. The same man from the cafe spoke quietly. We're ready. Olivia took a deep breath. When? Tomorrow evening. Her heart pounded. She looked out of her apartment window at the dark city below. Make sure she disappears. We'll handle it. The call ended. Olivia slowly lowered the phone. For just a moment, doubt entered her mind. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She knew an innocent woman could get hurt. She even remembered Grace's calm voice during their conversation at the construction site. But instead of listening to her conscience, Olivia pushed those thoughts away. Her jealousy had become stronger than her kindness. She convinced herself that removing Grace was the only way to win Daniel's heart. As she switched off the lights and prepared for bed, she whispered to herself, by this time tomorrow, Grace will be gone. She did not realize that her dangerous decision would soon destroy her own future instead. The next day began like any other day at the construction site. The sun rose slowly over the city, filling the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. Workers arrived one after another, greeting each other with smiles before putting on their helmets and gloves. Grace arrived early, as she always did. She unlocked the small storage room where the tools were kept and carefully arranged everything before the other workers arrived. Morning, Grace, Peter called as he walked through the gate. Good morning, Peter, Grace replied with a smile. You always beat everyone here. Grace laughed. Someone has to make sure everything is ready. Peter shook his head with a grin. I don't know where you get all your energy. Grace smiled. I've been doing hard work for many years. My body is used to it. Soon the site became busy. The sound of hammers echoed through the air. Machines lifted heavy steel beams. Workers mixed cement and carried bricks from one place to another. Daniel arrived around mid-morning. The workers greeted him warmly. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Morning, everyone, Daniel replied. As usual, his eyes searched the site until they found Grace. She was helping two younger workers lift a large stack of concrete blocks onto a platform. Daniel smiled. Even after weeks of knowing her, he was still amazed by her strength. When Grace noticed him, she waved. Good morning, Daniel. Good morning, Grace. He walked over. You've already done half a day's work. Grace laughed. That's because I started early. Daniel smiled. I should have guessed. The two talked for a few minutes before Grace returned to work. Daniel spent the rest of the morning inspecting the building with the site manager. But every now and then he looked toward Grace. She worked with the same determination he had admired from the very beginning. During lunch break, Daniel and Grace sat beneath the large tree where they often talked. The cool breeze made the afternoon feel pleasant. Daniel handed Grace a sandwich. I brought an extra one. Grace smiled. You keep spoiling me. Daniel laughed. I also brought fruit. Grace looked at the bag. There are enough apples for everyone. Exactly. Grace stood up and began sharing the fruit with the workers nearby. Daniel watched her. She never kept good things for herself. She always thought about others first. When she finally sat back down, Daniel smiled. You always share. Grace shrugged. My mother used to say that food tastes better when everyone has something to eat. Daniel nodded. She sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. They spent the rest of lunch talking about simple things. Grace told funny stories about her childhood. Daniel shared memories from when he first started his business. By the time lunch ended, both of them were smiling. Neither of them noticed Olivia's car parked far outside the construction site. She watched them from a distance through the windshield. Every laugh she saw made her jealousy grow stronger. She whispered quietly, "Enjoy today." Her voice was cold. "It will be your last happy day together." Then she drove away. The afternoon passed peacefully. The workers continued building the new apartment complex. By evening, the site manager announced the end of the workday. All right, everyone. Good work today. The workers slowly packed away their tools. Some left in groups. Others rode bicycles home. Within a short time, only a few people remained. Grace stayed behind for a few extra minutes to clean the wheelbarrows and return the tools to storage. Daniel had already left for an important business meeting earlier that afternoon. Before leaving, he had smiled at Grace. I'll stop by tomorrow. I'll be here, Grace had replied. Now the construction site was almost empty. Grace picked up her small backpack and started walking toward the old storage building where she slept. The evening air was calm. The road outside the construction site was quiet. She enjoyed the peaceful walk after a long day of hard work. She had no idea that several people were hiding nearby. A dark van slowly rolled toward the side of the road. Inside were 4 men. The driver looked ahead. That's her. One man in the back nodded. The boss said to take her quickly. Another opened the sliding door. Let's finish this. The van stopped beside Grace. Before she could react, the side door flew open. 4 men jumped out. You, one shouted. Grab her. Grace immediately stepped backward. What do you want? Don't ask questions. One of the men reached for her arm. Grace quickly pulled away. I said leave me alone. The second man rushed toward her. Grace reacted without thinking. She grabbed his wrist and pushed him aside. The man stumbled and fell onto the dusty road. What? Another man shouted. She's stronger than she looks. Grace looked around. There was nobody nearby. She realized these men wanted to kidnap her. She took a deep breath. I'm not going with you. The biggest man charged at her. Grace moved aside just in time. He lost his balance. Using all the strength she had built from years of carrying bricks and cement, she pushed him hard. He crashed into the side of the van. The loud bang surprised the others. "Get her!" the driver yelled. Another attacker swung a wooden stick toward Grace. She raised her arm and blocked the blow. The impact hurt, but she refused to give up. She kicked the stick out of the man's hands. It landed several feet away. The workers at the construction site often joked that Grace was stronger than many of the men. Now the attackers were discovering that the joke was true. She defended herself with courage and determination. One man tried to grab her from behind. Grace quickly bent forward. The man lost his grip and fell over her shoulder onto the ground. The attackers stared at one another in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. She's fighting back. At that very moment, Daniel was driving back from his business meeting. He had forgotten an important folder at the construction site. "I'll pick it up before going home," he told his driver. As their SUV approached the entrance, Daniel noticed movement on the road. Several men surrounded someone. He looked carefully. His heart skipped. Grace! Without thinking, he opened the car door before it had fully stopped. "Sir!" his driver shouted. But Daniel was already running. "Leave her alone!" he yelled. Grace looked up. "Daniel!" The attackers turned. One of them recognized him immediately. "It's Brooks!" "Panic!" another shouted. "If he sees us, we're finished." Daniel reached Grace. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." One of the attackers looked around nervously. "We have to leave." "But she's getting away." The biggest man became desperate. He reached inside his jacket. Grace's eyes widened. "Daniel! Watch out!" The attacker pulled out a handgun. Everything happened in only a few seconds. Daniel instinctively stepped in front of Grace. "I said leave her alone." The frightened attacker raised the gun. A loud bang echoed through the evening air. Bang! For a brief moment, everything became silent. Daniel looked down. A dark red stain slowly spread across his white shirt. Grace gasped. "Daniel!" He tried to speak, but no words came out. Then his knees gave way. He collapsed onto the ground. "Daniel!" Grace screamed. The attackers froze. None of them had expected anyone to be shot. "We've got to go!" the driver shouted. The men quickly jumped back into the van. Its tires screeched as it sped away into the evening. Grace did not chase them. Her only concern was Daniel. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Daniel!" He was breathing, but weakly. His eyes were beginning to close. "No, no, stay with me." She gently pressed her hands against the wound to slow the bleeding. Tears filled her eyes. "You can't leave me." Daniel looked at her weakly. His lips moved. "Grace, I'm here. You are safe." Grace nodded through her tears. "I'm safe. Please don't talk." People from nearby shops had heard the gunshot. Within moments, several people came running. Someone shouted, "Call an ambulance." Another person called the police. Grace stayed beside Daniel, holding his hand tightly. "You promised you'd come back tomorrow," she whispered. "So you have to keep that promise." The sound of ambulance sirens soon filled the air. Paramedics rushed out carrying medical equipment. They quickly began treating Daniel before carefully placing him onto a stretcher. One paramedic looked at Grace. "Are you coming?" Without hesitation, she nodded. "Yes." As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped toward the hospital, Grace looked at Daniel lying unconscious beside her. She silently prayed with all her heart. She did not care about money. She did not care about the attackers. She only wanted one thing. She wanted Daniel to survive. The ambulance raced through the busy streets with its siren screaming. Cars quickly moved aside to clear the road. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked as fast as they could. One checked Daniel's heartbeat. Another placed an oxygen mask over his face. A third pressed clean bandages against the gunshot wound to stop the bleeding. Grace sat beside him, her hands shaking. Her dusty work clothes were stained with Daniel's blood. She held his hand tightly. "Please stay with me," she whispered. "You have to be okay." Daniel's eyes were closed. He did not answer. One of the paramedics looked at Grace. "Ma'am, we'll do everything we can." Grace nodded. "I know." But inside she was terrified. She had never been this afraid in her life. Only a short time ago, Daniel had been smiling and talking with her. Now he lay unconscious, fighting for his life. Grace quietly prayed, "God, please don't let him die." When the ambulance reached the hospital, doctors and nurses were already waiting outside. The back doors opened. The medical team quickly rolled Daniel inside. "Gunshot wound," one paramedic shouted. "Prepare the operating room." Doctors rushed him down the hallway. Grace tried to follow, but a nurse gently stopped her. "I'm sorry. You have to wait here." Grace looked toward Daniel as he disappeared through the swinging doors. "Please save him." "We'll do our best," the nurse replied before hurrying away. The hallway suddenly became quiet. Grace stood alone. She looked at the blood on her hands. Her knees became weak. She slowly sat down in one of the waiting room chairs. Only then did she realize she was crying. About 20 minutes later, Daniel's driver rushed into the hospital. He had followed the ambulance. "Miss Grace." Grace stood up immediately. "How is he?" "They've taken him into surgery." The driver lowered his head. "I've already informed the company's head office." Grace nodded. "They're doing everything they can." The driver sat beside her. Neither of them spoke. The waiting felt endless. Every minute seemed like an hour. At Daniel's company headquarters, Olivia was finishing some paperwork when her phone rang. She answered without looking at the caller's name. "Hello." The voice on the other end sounded frightened. "It went wrong." Olivia froze. "What happened?" The billionaire showed up. Her heart began beating faster. "What?" He tried to protect the woman. Olivia felt her hands grow cold. There was a struggle. And the man hesitated. One of the guys fired a gun. Olivia's face turned pale. Silence filled the room. Finally, she whispered, "Is Grace dead?" "No." Olivia closed her eyes. "Then what happened?" "The billionaire was shot." For several seconds, Olivia could not breathe. You shot Daniel?" "It wasn't planned. We panicked." He jumped in front of her. Olivia slowly lowered herself into her chair. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had wanted Grace taken away. She had never wanted Daniel to be hurt. The man continued speaking. "We're leaving town. You'd better keep quiet." The call ended. Olivia stared at her phone. Her hands trembled. What have I done? For the first time, fear was greater than jealousy. Back at the hospital, the red light above the operating room remained on. Grace continued waiting. Hours passed. Workers from the construction site began arriving. Peter hurried through the entrance. "Grace." She looked up. "Peter. How is he?" "They're still operating." Peter sighed. Soon more workers arrived. The site manager came. Security guards came. Several company employees also arrived. Everyone waited together. Nobody wanted to leave. Daniel had always treated his workers with kindness. Now they wanted to support him. One older worker quietly said, "He's a good man." Peter nodded. "He doesn't deserve this." Grace listened silently. She blamed herself. "If I wasn't there." Peter gently interrupted. "No." She looked at him. "This isn't your fault. They came after you." "If Daniel hadn't tried to help me." Peter shook his head. "Daniel made his own choice. He chose to protect someone he cared about." Grace looked down. Tears rolled down her cheeks again. Late that night, the operating room doors finally opened. Everyone quickly stood. A doctor removed his surgical mask and looked at the group. Grace hurried forward. "Doctor." The doctor smiled gently. The surgery was successful. Grace covered her mouth. "Really?" The doctor nodded. "The bullet was removed. We were able to stop the bleeding." Everyone let out a deep breath. Peter smiled. "Thank God." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Can I see him?" "Not yet. He's still unconscious. We've moved him to the intensive care unit." Grace nodded. "Thank you, doctor." The doctor smiled. "He's alive because he reached the hospital quickly." Grace silently thanked the ambulance workers in her heart. The next morning, Daniel remained unconscious. Machines beside his bed quietly beeped. His room was peaceful. Outside, Grace sat in the waiting area. She had refused to go home. In fact, she had nowhere to go. She spent the entire night sitting in the same chair. One of the nurses walked over. "You should eat something." Grace smiled politely. "I'm not hungry. You need your strength." "I'm all right." The nurse disappeared and returned a few minutes later carrying a small tray. "There. You don't have to pay." Grace looked surprised. "Thank you." The nurse smiled. "You've been sitting here all night. You deserve something warm." Grace quietly ate a little soup. It was the first meal she had eaten since the attack. Throughout the day, visitors came and went. Business partners, company managers, employees, construction workers. Everyone asked the same question. "How is Mr. Brooks?" The doctors gave the same answer. "He's stable, but he needs rest." Grace remained outside his room. She prayed quietly. Sometimes she read one of the old magazines in the waiting room. Other times she simply stared at the closed hospital door. She refused to leave. Meanwhile, Olivia stayed inside her apartment. She ignored every phone call from work. She turned off the television. She avoided the news, but she could not avoid her own thoughts. She remembered Daniel smiling at her over the years. She remembered him thanking her for her hard work. She remembered every kind word he had ever spoken. Now he was lying in a hospital because of the people she had hired. She burst into tears. "I never wanted this." She buried her face in her hands. "What have I become?" But no amount of crying could change what had happened. 3 days later, Daniel slowly opened his eyes. The room looked blurry. He heard the soft beeping of machines. A nurse noticed immediately. "Doctor." The doctor quickly entered. "Mr. Brooks." Daniel blinked slowly. He tried to speak. His voice was weak. "Grace." The doctor smiled. "Take it easy. You're safe." Daniel looked around. "Grace." The doctor nodded. "She's been waiting outside your room every single day." Daniel smiled faintly. "Can I see her?" "Of course." The doctor stepped outside. A few moments later, Grace walked into the room. The moment she saw Daniel awake, tears filled her eyes. She smiled through them. "You're awake." Daniel smiled weakly. "I kept my promise." Grace laughed and cried at the same time. "You did. You came back." She gently held his hand. "I was so scared." Daniel looked at her. "Are you all right?" Grace nodded. "I'm fine. You saved me." Daniel slowly shook his head. "I couldn't let anything happen to you." Grace could no longer hold back her tears. She carefully hugged him, making sure not to hurt his injured shoulder. "Thank you." Daniel smiled. Seeing Grace beside him gave him strength. Outside the room, Peter looked through the small glass window. He smiled. "I've never seen two people care about each other so much." The site manager nodded. "Love doesn't always begin in fancy places. Sometimes it begins where people least expect it." Inside the hospital room, Daniel and Grace looked at one another with quiet smiles. Neither of them had spoken the words yet. But after everything they had been through, their hearts already knew the truth. Their love had become stronger than fear, stronger than pain, and stronger than the terrible attack that had tried to tear them apart. Neither of them knew that the police investigation was moving quickly. Very soon, the truth about the attack would finally come to light. The morning sun shone through the windows of the hospital as Daniel slowly recovered. Although he was awake now, the doctors told him he still needed plenty of rest. The bullet had missed his heart by only a short distance. They said he had been very lucky. Grace stayed close to him every day. She helped him sit up when the nurses allowed it. She poured him water. She made sure he ate his meals. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply smiled at each other without saying a word. Daniel's company managers also visited every day. The workers from the construction site came in small groups to wish him a quick recovery. Peter smiled as he stood beside Daniel's bed. "We all miss seeing you at the construction site." Daniel smiled. "I miss all of you too." Peter looked at Grace. "And we miss Grace carrying all the heavy bricks by herself." Everyone laughed. Grace shook her head. "I don't carry everything." Peter grinned. "You carry more than the rest of us." The laughter made the hospital room feel brighter. After a few minutes, the workers said goodbye and returned to work. Later that afternoon, 2 police officers arrived at the hospital. One was Inspector Michael. The other was Officer Sarah. They politely knocked before entering Daniel's room. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks." Daniel nodded. "Good afternoon." Inspector Michael smiled kindly. "How are you feeling today?" "Better. I'm still a little weak." "We're glad you're recovering." Grace stood up. "I'll wait outside." Daniel looked at her. "You can stay." The inspector smiled. "That's perfectly fine." He opened a notebook. "We're investigating the attack that happened outside your construction site." Daniel nodded. "I understand. We'd like to ask you a few questions." "I'll answer whatever I can." Inspector Michael began writing. "Did you recognize any of the attackers?" Daniel thought for a moment. "No. It all happened very quickly. I only remember seeing 4 men. Were they speaking to anyone before the attack?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Officer Sarah looked at Grace. "What about you?" Grace answered calmly. "They tried to force me into a van. When I fought back, they became angry. Then Daniel arrived." Inspector Michael nodded. "Did any of them say who sent them?" Grace lowered her head. "No. They only kept saying, 'Grab her.'" The officers thanked them. "We're following several leads. We're also checking nearby security cameras." Daniel nodded. "I hope you find them." Inspector Michael smiled. "We intend to." After leaving the hospital, the police drove back to their station. Several detectives were already reviewing security camera footage collected from nearby businesses. One detective called out, "Inspector." Michael walked over. "What did you find?" "We've located a camera facing the road outside the construction site." The inspector watched the video. The recording clearly showed the dark van stopping beside Grace. 4 men jumped out. Grace fought back. Then Daniel arrived. Moments later, the gunshot could be seen. The attackers rushed back into the van before speeding away. Inspector Michael paused the video. "Can we read the license plate?" The technician zoomed in. "It isn't very clear." He adjusted the picture several times. Finally, several numbers became visible. "We've got enough." Inspector Michael smiled. "Excellent. Run the plate." Within an hour, the police discovered that the van had been rented using fake identification. But they did not stop there. They searched traffic cameras across the city. Eventually, they found the same van entering an old warehouse district. Police officers immediately surrounded the area. Several suspects tried to escape, but they had nowhere to run. Within minutes, all 4 men were arrested. At the police station, the suspects were questioned one by one. At first, none of them spoke. Inspector Michael placed several photographs on the table. Pictures of the van. Pictures from the security cameras. Pictures showing each man's face. "We already know you were there." One of the men looked away. The inspector continued. "The only question left is this. Who hired you?" The room became silent. No one answered. Hours passed. Finally, the youngest man sighed deeply. "I'll tell you." The others looked at him with angry faces. "You can't." "I'm tired." The inspector leaned forward. "Go ahead." The man swallowed nervously. "We didn't choose the woman ourselves. Someone paid us." "Who?" He looked down. "A woman." "What woman?" "Her name." He hesitated. "Olivia." The room became completely silent. Inspector Michael wrote down the name. "Olivia who?" The man gave her full name. He also explained where they had met. "The meeting happened at a small cafe. She gave us money. She told us to kidnap the bricklayer." Inspector Michael looked surprised. "The bricklayer?" "Yes. She said not to hurt anyone. So who fired the gun? The man pointed toward one of the other suspects. He panicked when Mr. Brooks appeared. The second man lowered his head. I never meant to shoot him. I got scared. Inspector Michael closed his notebook. Your statements will be recorded. The following morning, the police visited the cafe. They spoke with the manager. They checked the security cameras inside the building. Sure enough, the recordings clearly showed Olivia sitting with one of the suspects. The manager even remembered her. She seemed nervous. Did they meet for long? Around 20 minutes. The evidence continued growing. The police also searched Olivia's phone records. They discovered several calls between her and the suspects. Everything matched the attacker's statements. Inspector Michael looked at Officer Sarah. I think we have enough. Sarah nodded. I agree. Let's bring her in. Meanwhile, Olivia was sitting alone inside her apartment. She had not gone to work since the attack. Her curtains remained closed. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she remembered Daniel falling to the ground after being shot. She whispered to herself, I never wanted him hurt. A loud knock suddenly echoed through the apartment. Knock! 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 Olivia froze. She slowly walked to the door. Who is it? Police. Her heart almost stopped. She opened the door. Inspector Michael stood outside with several officers. Olivia? Yes. We need you to come with us. What for? We're investigating the attack on Daniel Brooks. Olivia tried to remain calm. I don't know anything about it. The inspector looked at her quietly. We have security footage. We have phone records. We have witness statements. And we have the men you hired. Olivia's face became pale. She stepped backward. She could not find any words. Officer Sarah gently placed handcuffs on her wrists. You are under arrest. Tears filled Olivia's eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. The neighbors watched silently as she was escorted to the police car. News of the arrest quickly spread across the city. Television stations reported the shocking story. People could hardly believe it. The billionaire's personal assistant planned the kidnapping? That's unbelievable. Workers at the construction site gathered during lunch break. Peter looked at the news on his phone. They caught the people responsible. The older worker smiled. That's good. Peter continued reading. They say Olivia hired them. Everyone became silent. The site manager slowly shook his head. I never expected that. Grace also heard the news. She felt sadness instead of happiness. She remembered Olivia's warning weeks earlier. She remembered the pain she had seen in Olivia's eyes. Grace quietly whispered, I wish she had chosen another path. Peter looked at her. After everything she did? Grace nodded. Jealousy destroyed her life. No one wins when hate takes over. Peter sighed. I suppose you're right. Later that day, Inspector Michael visited Daniel in the hospital. He smiled as he entered the room. I have some news. Daniel looked up. You found them? Yes. And we know who planned everything. Daniel nodded. Who? The inspector spoke gently. It was Olivia. For a moment, Daniel thought he had heard the wrong name. My personal assistant? The inspector nodded. She admitted knowing the men after we confronted her with the evidence. Daniel stared quietly at the blanket covering his legs. He could hardly believe it. Olivia had worked beside him for 5 years. He had trusted her completely. He never imagined she could do something like this. Grace gently placed her hand over his. Daniel looked at her. I don't understand. Grace spoke softly. Sometimes jealousy makes people forget what is right. Daniel sighed deeply. I wish things had never reached this point. Inspector Michael closed his notebook. She will face the court. The men who attacked you will also be charged. Daniel nodded slowly. Thank you, Inspector. After the officers left, the room became quiet. Daniel looked at Grace. I almost lost my life. Grace squeezed his hand gently. But you didn't. Daniel smiled. No. He looked into her eyes. And now I know something for certain. Grace tilted her head. What is it? Daniel smiled warmly. Life is too short to hide what truly matters. Grace felt her heart beat a little faster. She had a feeling that once Daniel recovered completely, both of their lives were about to change forever. Several weeks passed after Olivia's arrest. The police completed their investigation, and the case was sent to court. The 4 men who had attacked Grace and shot Daniel remained in prison while waiting for their trial. Olivia was also being held because the police had found enough evidence to show that she had planned the kidnapping. Meanwhile, Daniel continued recovering in the hospital. Every day he became a little stronger. The doctors were pleased with his progress. "You're healing very well," Dr. Wilson said during one of his morning checkups. Daniel smiled. "That's good to hear. If everything continues like this, you'll be able to leave the hospital in a few days." Daniel looked toward the window. "I've been waiting to hear those words." The doctor laughed. "I can tell. You've been a very patient patient." Daniel smiled. "I've had a good reason." The doctor followed his eyes and saw Grace sitting quietly near the window, reading a magazine. He smiled knowingly. "I think I know the reason." Daniel laughed softly but said nothing. Grace had visited Daniel every single day since he had been admitted to the hospital. She never missed a day. Every morning she arrived before visiting hours began. She greeted the nurses politely. She helped Daniel eat when his shoulder hurt too much to move. She encouraged him during his physical therapy exercises. Whenever he became discouraged because he could not move as quickly as before, Grace always reminded him to stay hopeful. "You've already come this far," she would say. "You'll get stronger every day." Daniel always smiled after hearing those words. "You always know exactly what to say." Grace laughed. "I just say what's in my heart." The nurses noticed how much they cared for each other. One afternoon, Nurse Linda quietly whispered to another nurse, "I don't think I've ever seen someone so devoted." The other nurse smiled. "Neither have I. She isn't here because she has to be. She's here because she truly loves him." Daniel overheard them and smiled to himself. A few days later, the doctors finally gave Daniel permission to leave the hospital. The news spread quickly. Company employees, construction workers, and friends gathered outside the hospital to welcome him. As Daniel slowly walked through the front doors with Grace beside him, everyone began clapping. "Welcome back, Mr. Brooks. We're so happy you're better." Peter stepped forward carrying a bouquet of flowers. "It's good to have you back." Daniel smiled warmly. "Thank you, Peter." The older worker also stepped forward. "We've been praying for you every day." Daniel nodded. "I felt those prayers. I wouldn't be standing here without all of your support." Grace smiled as she watched everyone surround Daniel with kindness. She realized just how many lives he had touched over the years. People did not love him because he was rich. They loved him because he had always treated them with respect. Instead of returning directly to his mansion, Daniel asked his driver to make one stop first. "The construction site," he said. The driver smiled. "I thought you might say that." A short time later, the familiar black SUV pulled through the construction site gates. The workers immediately noticed it. "The boss is back." Everyone stopped working for a moment to greet him. Daniel slowly stepped out of the vehicle. He was still healing, so he walked more carefully than before. The workers gathered around him. "It's wonderful to see you. We missed you." Daniel smiled. "I missed all of you too." He thanked each worker for their support during his recovery. Then his eyes found Grace. She stood a few steps away, smiling quietly. Daniel walked over to her. "I never got the chance to properly thank you." Grace looked surprised. "You don't need to thank me. I do. If you hadn't fought those men, if you hadn't stayed beside me, if you hadn't encouraged me every day." He smiled warmly. "I don't know where I'd be." Grace shook her head. "I simply cared about you." Daniel looked into her eyes. "And that means more to me than you'll ever know." Later that afternoon, most of the workers returned to their jobs. Daniel and Grace walked slowly through the construction site together. The unfinished apartment building stood taller than before. Daniel smiled. "The workers have done an amazing job." Grace nodded proudly. They've worked very hard. They reached the large tree where they had shared so many conversations. Daniel stopped walking. This tree has become special to me. Grace smiled. We've spent a lot of time here. We have. They sat on the same wooden bench they had used many times before. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves above them. For several moments, neither of them spoke. The silence felt peaceful. Finally, Daniel took a deep breath. Grace. She looked at him. Yes. There is something I've wanted to tell you for a long time. Grace's heart began beating a little faster. She listened carefully. When I first came to this construction site, I noticed your strength. Grace smiled softly. I remember. But after getting to know you, Daniel looked directly into her eyes. I realized your heart is even stronger than your muscles. Grace laughed quietly. I don't think anyone has ever said that to me before. Daniel smiled. It's true. You've taught me kindness. You've taught me courage. You've reminded me that happiness isn't something money can buy. Grace looked down shyly. You give me too much credit. No, I don't. Daniel gently reached for her hand. She looked at him with surprise but did not pull away. I've spent years searching for success. I found it. I've spent years building businesses. I did that too. But I never expected to find the most valuable thing of all. Grace's voice became very soft. What is that? Daniel smiled. You. Grace felt tears fill her eyes. For a moment, she could not speak. Daniel continued. I love you, Grace. I've loved you for a long time. I think I started falling in love with you the very first day I saw you carrying those heavy bricks. Grace laughed through her tears. You noticed that? I couldn't stop noticing. She smiled. I've been trying to hide my feelings too. Daniel looked surprised. You have? Grace nodded. I kept telling myself it wasn't possible. You're a billionaire. I'm a homeless bricklayer. I thought our worlds were too different. Daniel gently squeezed her hand. Our worlds may be different, but our hearts understand each other. Grace smiled. I love you too. Those 4 simple words filled Daniel's heart with joy. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. Neither cared about money. Neither cared about social status. They only cared about the person sitting beside them. Daniel slowly stood up. Grace looked confused. What are you doing? He smiled. There is one more thing. Carefully, because of his healing shoulder, Daniel lowered himself onto one knee. Grace covered her mouth. Daniel! Workers nearby noticed what was happening. One by one, they quietly stopped working. Peter whispered, I think this is it. The entire construction site became silent. Daniel looked up at Grace. Grace! You came into my life when I wasn't looking for love. You showed me what real strength looks like. You risked your life to protect me. You stayed beside me when I was at my weakest. I don't want to spend another day without you. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box. Inside was a beautiful diamond ring. Grace, will you marry me? Tears rolled down Grace's cheeks. She looked around at the smiling workers before looking back at Daniel. For a few seconds, she could not speak. Finally, she nodded. Yes. Daniel smiled. Yes. Grace laughed through her tears. Yes. I'll marry you. The workers erupted into loud cheers. Peter jumped into the air. She said yes. Everyone clapped and celebrated. Daniel gently placed the ring on Grace's finger. Then he carefully stood up. Grace threw her arms around him in a gentle hug, careful not to hurt his healing shoulder. I never imagined this day, she whispered. Daniel smiled. Neither did I. As the workers continued cheering around them, the site manager quietly wiped away a tear. He smiled at Peter. Who would have thought? Peter grinned. The billionaire and the strongest bricklayer on the site. The older worker laughed. Sometimes the best love stories begin in the most unexpected places. As the sun slowly set behind the unfinished building, Daniel and Grace stood hand in hand. The difficult days were finally behind them. Ahead of them was a future filled with hope, love, and the promise of a beautiful life together. The news of Daniel Brooks and Grace's engagement spread across the city within a few days. People could hardly believe it. Newspapers wrote stories about the billionaire who had fallen in love with a homeless bricklayer. Television stations talked about how Grace had bravely fought off kidnappers and stayed by Daniel's side while he recovered in the hospital. Some people were surprised. Others smiled because they believed true love had found two good people. At the construction site, the workers were happier than ever. Peter held up his phone during lunch break. "Look!" The workers gathered around him. One newspaper headline read, "Billionaire to marry the bricklayer who saved his life." Everyone smiled. The older worker laughed. "I knew they would end up together." Another worker nodded. You could see it in the way they looked at each other. Grace laughed as she listened. "You all noticed before we did." Peter smiled. It was impossible not to notice. Everyone laughed together. Grace still felt shy whenever people talked about her relationship with Daniel. She had never expected her life to change so much. Only a few months earlier, she had been sleeping in an old storage building beside the construction site. Now she was planning her wedding. Sometimes it still felt like a dream. Daniel also returned to work after recovering. Although his doctors told him not to work too hard, he slowly began attending meetings again. One afternoon, he called all the company managers together. "I have an announcement." Everyone looked at him. "I'm getting married next month." The room immediately filled with applause. "Congratulations, sir. We're so happy for you." Daniel smiled. "Thank you." One manager asked with a grin, "Will the wedding be private?" Daniel shook his head. "No. I want everyone who has been part of our journey to celebrate with us." He smiled, especially the workers from the construction site. The managers nodded. They understood why. Without those workers, Daniel would never have met Grace. Meanwhile, Grace had another surprise waiting for her. One morning, Daniel drove her to a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city. Grace looked around curiously. "Why are we here?" Daniel smiled. "I want to show you something." They stopped in front of a small, beautiful house. It had white walls, a blue roof, colorful flowers in the front yard, and a little garden behind it. Grace stared at it. "It's beautiful." Daniel smiled. "Come inside." They walked through the front door. The house had a cozy living room, a bright kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and large windows that filled the rooms with sunlight. Grace slowly walked through each room. She touched the walls gently, almost afraid the house would disappear. Finally, she turned toward Daniel. "Whose house is this?" Daniel smiled warmly. "It's yours." Grace's eyes became wide. "What? You once told me your biggest dream." Grace remembered immediately. "I said I wanted a small house and a little garden." Daniel nodded. "I remembered every word." Grace could no longer hold back her tears. "You remembered?" "I remember everything you tell me." Grace looked around again. The house was not enormous like Daniel's mansion. It was exactly what she had dreamed about. Simple, peaceful, comfortable. She hugged Daniel tightly. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me." Daniel smiled. "You deserve it." Grace looked out toward the small garden. "My mother would have loved this place." Daniel gently held her hand. "I think she would be proud of the woman you've become." Grace smiled through her tears. "So do I." As the wedding day drew closer, preparations became busy. Daniel hired a wedding planner, but Grace wanted to help with every decision. "I don't want something too fancy," she said. "I want everyone to feel welcome." Daniel laughed. "I knew you'd say that." Grace smiled. "I don't care about expensive decorations. I care about the people." So together they planned a simple but beautiful wedding. Fresh white flowers decorated the ceremony. Long tables were prepared for guests. A live band was invited to play soft music. Most importantly, every worker from the construction site received a personal invitation. When Peter received his invitation, he smiled proudly. "I've never been invited to a billionaire's wedding before." The older worker laughed. "Neither have I." Peter carefully placed the invitation inside his bag. "I'm keeping this forever." The wedding day finally arrived. The morning sky was bright and clear. It was a perfect day. Guests arrived early. Business leaders, company employees, construction workers, neighbors, friends. Even some nurses from the hospital attended because they had become so fond of Daniel and Grace during his recovery. Everyone smiled as they took their seats. Daniel stood at the front wearing a well-tailored black suit. He looked calm, but inside he was excited. Peter quietly whispered to another worker, "I've never seen the boss look nervous." The worker smiled. "I think today is the happiest day of his life." The music began. Everyone stood. The doors slowly opened. Grace stepped inside. A soft gasp filled the room. She looked beautiful in a simple white wedding dress. The dress was elegant without being overly fancy. She wore a small necklace and carried a bouquet of white roses. Her smile shone brighter than anything else. Daniel could not take his eyes off her. As Grace slowly walked toward him, she remembered everything that had happened. She remembered sleeping in the old storage building. She remembered carrying heavy bricks every day. She remembered fighting the kidnappers. She remembered crying outside the operating room. Now she was walking toward the man she loved. She quietly thanked God in her heart. When she finally reached Daniel, he smiled. "You look beautiful." Grace laughed softly. "You've already told me that 3 times today." Daniel grinned. "I'll probably say it 3 more times." She smiled. "I don't mind." The guests laughed gently. The ceremony began. The minister welcomed everyone. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the love between Daniel Brooks and Grace." He spoke about kindness. He spoke about forgiveness. He spoke about love that looks beyond money, appearance, and social status. Everyone listened carefully. Then it was time for the vows. Daniel looked into Grace's eyes. "I promise to love you. I promise to respect you. I promise to stand beside you through every joy and every challenge. You showed me what real courage looks like. You loved me when I needed you most. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never face life alone again." Grace smiled as tears filled her eyes. Then she spoke. "I promise to love you with all my heart. I promise to always tell you the truth. I promise to stand beside you no matter what happens. You never judged me because I was poor. You saw the person inside. You gave me hope when I thought life had forgotten me. I will always be thankful for your love." Many guests wiped away tears. Even Peter quietly reached into his pocket for a handkerchief. The minister smiled warmly. "May I have the rings?" Daniel gently placed a beautiful wedding band on Grace's finger. Grace placed Daniel's ring on his hand. The minister looked at them with a smile. "By the authority given to me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Daniel gently kissed Grace. The room exploded with applause. Everyone stood cheering. The sound of happiness filled the hall. The celebration continued at a beautiful reception. There was music, dancing, delicious food, and joyful laughter. Daniel and Grace walked from table to table, thanking every guest personally. When they reached the construction workers' table, Peter stood up. "We have something for you." Grace looked surprised. "You didn't have to buy us anything." Peter smiled. "It isn't expensive. It's from all of us." The workers handed them a framed photograph. It showed Grace carrying bricks on her very first day at the construction site, while Daniel stood in the background during his first visit. Grace laughed through happy tears. "I remember this day." Daniel smiled. "So do I." The older worker pointed at the picture. "None of us knew we were watching the beginning of a love story." Everyone laughed. Daniel looked around at the workers. "I'll never forget where this journey began." He raised his glass. "To every worker who builds not only buildings, but also hope." The workers raised their glasses too. Cheers! As the evening came to an end, Daniel and Grace stepped outside for a quiet moment. The stars sparkled above them. Grace slipped her hand into Daniel's. "Husband." Daniel smiled. "I like the sound of that." Grace laughed. "I like saying it." Daniel looked at her with a warm smile. "If someone had told me that a visit to one construction site would change my life forever, I would never have believed them. Grace squeezed his hand gently. And if someone had told me that a billionaire would fall in love with a homeless bricklayer, I would have laughed. They both smiled. Together they looked up at the night sky. Their difficult journey had brought them to this beautiful moment. The chapter of hardship was finally behind them. A wonderful new chapter of love, family, and hope had just begun. The morning after their wedding, Daniel and Grace woke up in their new home with happy hearts. The sun shone through the windows, filling every room with warm light. Birds sang outside, and a gentle breeze moved through the small garden behind the house. Grace walked to the kitchen and looked out the window. She smiled. Just a few months ago, she had been sleeping inside an old storage building at the construction site. When it rained, she had to place buckets on the floor to catch the water leaking through the roof. Now she stood inside a warm, peaceful home. Still felt like a dream. Daniel walked into the kitchen and smiled when he saw her. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks." Grace laughed. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." Daniel wrapped his arms around her. "How does it feel to be married?" Grace smiled brightly. "It feels wonderful." Daniel kissed her forehead. "I'm glad." Grace looked around the kitchen. "I still can't believe this house belongs to us." Daniel smiled. "It always will." Grace shook her head with a laugh. "I keep expecting someone to knock on the door and tell us there has been a mistake." Daniel laughed too. "No one is going to say that. This is your home." Grace looked out toward the little garden. "My favorite part is the flowers." Daniel smiled. "I remembered you wanted a garden. You remembered every little thing." "I always will." Grace looked at him with grateful eyes. "You've made me the happiest woman in the world." Daniel gently held her hands. "You've made me the happiest man." They stood together for a few moments, enjoying the quiet morning. Their new life had begun. A few days later, Daniel returned to work. This time, Grace went with him. As their car entered the construction site, the workers immediately recognized them. "It's Mr. and Mrs. Brooks." Everyone stopped working for a moment and began clapping. Peter ran over with a huge smile. "Congratulations!" The older worker laughed. "I knew this day would come." Grace smiled warmly. "Thank you, everyone." Daniel looked around at the workers. "I have some good news." Everyone became quiet. "You have all worked very hard on this project." The workers nodded. "So I have decided that every worker on this site will receive a bonus." For a second, nobody spoke. Then loud cheers filled the air. "Thank you, sir. We appreciate it." Daniel smiled. "You've earned it." Grace looked at the workers celebrating. Seeing them happy made her heart happy too. After greeting everyone, Daniel and Grace walked around the construction site. Grace looked at the unfinished building. "So much has changed." Daniel nodded. "It has. I met you here." Grace smiled. "I remember the first day. You kept watching me carry bricks." Daniel laughed. "I couldn't believe one person was carrying so much." Grace laughed too. "I was just doing my job. And you were doing it better than anyone." They reached the old storage building where Grace had once slept. The small building looked exactly the same. The broken roof was still there. The cracked walls had not changed. Grace stood quietly. Daniel looked at her. "What are you thinking?" Grace smiled softly. "I remember every night I spent here." She slowly walked inside. The old blanket she had used was gone, but the room still felt familiar. She looked around. "I used to sit in that corner." She pointed toward one side of the room. When it rained, water came through the roof over there. Daniel gently held her hand. "You'll never have to sleep here again." Grace nodded. "I know, but I don't want to forget." Daniel looked at her. "Forget what?" "Where I came from." She smiled. "If I forget these days, I might stop appreciating what I have." Daniel nodded with respect. "I don't think you'll ever forget." Grace smiled. "I won't." As they walked back outside, Grace noticed something. A young woman sat alone near the entrance of the construction site. She looked tired. Her clothes were old. Beside her was a little boy who could not have been older than 7. The child looked hungry. Grace immediately walked over. Hello. The young woman looked up. Good morning. Grace smiled kindly. Are you all right? The woman lowered her eyes. I'm looking for work. I've been searching for weeks. No one will hire me. Grace looked at the little boy. Is this your son? Yes. Grace knelt beside him. Hello. The boy smiled shyly. Hello. Grace looked back at the woman. Have you both eaten today? The woman slowly shook her head. Grace stood. She turned toward Peter. Can you please bring them some food? Peter smiled. Right away. A few minutes later, the woman and her son were eating happily. Daniel watched Grace from a distance. He smiled. That's exactly who she is. She had once been homeless herself. Now she was helping someone else. Nothing about her kindness had changed. That evening, Daniel and Grace talked while sitting in their little garden. The flowers moved gently in the breeze. Grace looked at Daniel. I've been thinking. Daniel smiled. About what? I want to help people. You already do. I want to do even more. Daniel listened carefully. I know what it feels like to have no home. I know what it feels like to wonder where your next meal will come from. She looked down for a moment. I don't want others to feel alone. Daniel smiled warmly. What do you have in mind? Grace's eyes brightened. I want to build homes. Daniel looked surprised. Homes? For people who have nowhere to live. I also want to help them learn skills, so they can find jobs. Daniel smiled proudly. I think that's a wonderful idea. Grace looked at him. Do you really? I do. We'll do it together. Grace smiled. Really? Daniel nodded. My construction company builds luxury apartments. He smiled. We can also build hope. Grace reached for his hand. I would love that. Over the next year, Daniel and Grace worked together to start a charity. They built simple homes for families who had nowhere to live. They helped people find jobs. They paid school fees for children whose parents could not afford them. They donated food to families struggling to survive. Grace often visited construction sites to encourage workers. She never acted as though she was better than anyone else. Sometimes she even picked up bricks and carried them just to make the workers laugh. Peter smiled one afternoon. Mrs. Brooks. Grace laughed. Yes. You'll always be a bricklayer at heart. Grace laughed with him. I think you're right. Daniel watched from nearby. Seeing Grace happy made him smile every single day. Months later, Daniel stood on the stage during the opening ceremony of a new housing project. Many reporters had come. One reporter asked, Mr. Brooks, what inspired this project? Daniel smiled. My wife. The reporters looked toward Grace. Daniel continued, She taught me that success means more than making money. It means helping people. Grace smiled quietly. Another reporter asked Grace, What is the biggest lesson you've learned? Grace thought for a moment before answering. I learned that kindness is stronger than hate. She smiled. I also learned that where you begin in life does not decide where you will end. Many people clapped after hearing her words. Later that evening, Daniel and Grace visited the finished apartment building where they had first met. Families were now living there. Children played outside. Parents smiled as they carried groceries into their new homes. Grace looked around happily. Listen. Daniel smiled. What? The children. Their laughter filled the air. Grace smiled. That sound makes me happy. Daniel nodded. Me too. They walked toward the large tree where they had shared so many conversations. It was still standing. Grace touched its trunk gently. This tree watched our story begin. Daniel laughed. It certainly did. They sat on the same old bench. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the children playing nearby. Finally, Daniel turned toward Grace. If I had never visited this construction site that morning, Grace smiled. We never would have met. Daniel nodded. And my life would never have been the same. Grace gently rested her head on his shoulder. I'm glad you came. So am I. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the buildings, they held hands and watched the sky change from blue to orange. Their story had begun with a billionaire and a homeless bricklayer from two completely different worlds. Some people believed they could never belong together. But love had proved everyone wrong. Daniel had looked beyond Grace's old clothes and hard life. Grace had looked beyond Daniel's wealth and success. They had seen each other's hearts. Together, they built not only houses but also brighter futures for many people. Their lives became a reminder that true love is not measured by money, appearance, or social status. It is measured by kindness, respect, courage, and the willingness to stand by one another during both joyful and difficult times. And from that day forward, Daniel and Grace lived happily together, filling their home with laughter, helping those in need, and proving every single day that the strongest foundation anyone can build is a foundation of love. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the story, please subscribe to this channel and tell us where you are watching from.